Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Carnegie Council. My name is Chris Caldzanis. I'm a trustee of the council, and I'm here to welcome everybody and to introduce our panel. We have a fascinating topic, right? State of migration in 2025. We have an even better panel. So to the far left, Gregory Maniatis, he's the Director of Refugees and Migration Program at the Open Societies Foundation. And closer to me is Professor Michael Doyle. I'm very biased because Professor Doyle is a former trustee of the council, but he is also my PhD dissertation advisor and a very close mentor. So please accept my welcome remarks for Professor Doyle, understanding my bias. So migration is definitely one of the hardest topics that we face globally. And it is one of the hardest topics to apply ethics to it, which is why we at the council are so very focused from the top down on this topic. It is incredible to have somebody who I think is one of the foremost thinkers in political science tackle this topic and do so in such a thoughtful and sustained and detailed-oriented way. Professor Doyle has had positions in 5 of the most renowned and leading academic institutions in the world. I think the best position he had is at Columbia, where I met him. He's a university professor there, which is it's the highest position of the university. Over his career, he has grappled both theoretically and empirically with 3 topics that I believe are the hardest challenges we have had: democracy and its role in peace, then peace building. I think many of you in the audience will remember when peace building was considered the next silver bullet, right? And global constitutionalism, which is a topic which is how we actually met. He has practiced at the UN. He has been at Carnegie. He has held many different positions that combine the theory and the practice of international affairs and international politics. And he has won the highest awards of the American Political Association that academics give to people like Michael. But I think for purposes of today's presentation, he has been the leading voice and driver behind the Model International E-Mobility Convention, both in his position at the council, but also at Columbia University. He's a frequent author on this topic, and what I really love about Professor Doyle is that he attacks the right and the left with equal vigor. He does not spare anyone. I think a lot of us read the recent article where he challenged the right on certain immigration positions and the left on their conception of state boundaries. So with that introduction, thank you both to being here, and Professor Doyle, I will turn it to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that wonderful introduction. Let me recommend to anybody here in the audience, you should always have one of your most brilliant students do an introduction for you. It is a real treat. So thank you so much. I'm also delighted to be here at the Carnegie Council. I'm a former trustee from many years ago. Seeing what Joel has done for this institution is inspiring. This institution would not be what it is today without him. I really want to thank Kevin Maloney and Susan Han and Alex Woodson for all of the organization that led into this meeting. And I thank my fellow panelist and dear old friend, Gregory Maniatis, and the panelists to come for a very interesting afternoon. What I'd like to do is talk about MIMC, as we call it, the Model International Mobility Convention. I want to identify some things that are special about it, where it comes from, why we focus on the global level, because I'm going to be talking about the global in the first 10 or 15 minutes. Gregory's going to be talking about U.S. national policy. And then we have a wonderful panel who will engage on all of these issues, including drawing upon very serious practical experience dealing with actual refugees, asylum seekers, people crossing borders. And so I'm looking forward to all of that. The MIMC is distinctive because it's both comprehensive and cumulative. Those are the 2 foundations behind it. It's comprehensive in that it covers the movement of people across borders all the way from visitors, tourists, students, migrant workers, residents, investors, family reunification, then to refugees and forced migrants. It is really soup to nuts on the movement across borders. That was part of the design. The second part of the design is that it's cumulative. That is, it starts with the intuition that visitors need to be able to protect some basic rights whenever you visit a foreign country. If you get hit by a bus, you don't want them just to leave you in the road. You want to be taken to a hospital. If you hit somebody with your car, you want to have access to the court system. But not much more than that is needed for a visitor, other than getting the visa to go in. Tourists need to make sure that their tourist contracts are honored. Students need access to the university that they're studying in. They need a transcript. They need to know that they'll get fair treatment. Migrant workers and others need a fair recompense for their work. They need access to union protections. They need all the protections that go along that would be available to domestic workers within a country. Residents need to have their property contracts honored. Investors need to have an assurance of return on their investment to be able to repatriate funds. Refugees and forced migrants need all of the rights that they've been denied in the country that chased them out in the new country. But you can't basically claim across categories without specific authorization. If you show up as a tourist in the UK next week, you're not going to be able to vote in the next election. And therefore, there's rights and there are limitations. Comprehensive but cumulative. The rights increase as you move across these categories. The thematic thread is not very good prose, but it gets the idea. Everyone should have all of their rights met somewhere, while no one should be able to exercise all of their rights everywhere. That's a thematic thread underneath MIMC. It both is globalist in a certain way, but it's also sovereigntist. It respects national borders in a very significant fashion. Our methodology is that it's based upon people. We started meeting in 2015. We brought together some of the most eminent academics in the field of migration and refugees. They included people, Susan Martin, Guy Goodwin Gill, back on the previous page, Diego Acosta up there. We included eminent leaders of NGOs across the board. We included statesmen like Mats Carlson and others, Khalid Kozer, Francois Fouineau, and still others, all of whom were engaged in migration and refugees. So it was a combination of academic experience and also practical experience leading campaigns in NGOs, and also experience out in the field in the World Bank, in the IMF, in the UN, and elsewhere. It came from around the world. These are where commission members came from or where we did launch events. So we made an effort to go global, but frankly, it's still a little too northern. If you look at North America and Europe, it's still the predominant home. We made a real effort to go global. We didn't fully succeed. We're still working on that. The course of action you see here, we began in 2015, and we would not have been able to begin without the gentleman seated immediately to my left. He made available facilities in the Open Societies Foundation that allowed us to meet regularly and connect to people around the world. It was extremely appreciated. We produced a draft in 2016. We did some launch events in 2017. As academics, we did a special issue of the Columbia Journal of Transnational Law on MIMC. And ever since, we've been trying to promote it. And you'll notice that 20 has 2 question marks after it. It has not got easier since 2016 to promote the idea of global cooperation for migration. And it certainly hasn't got easier in the past few months, you could well imagine. So that's why those 2 question marks are out there. So where does it come from? were motivated both by the real world of the movement of people and also by jurisprudential limitations out there. With regard to the real movement, many of you know this as well, if not better than I do. There's been a significant increase in the number of migrants by the UN definition. That's somebody outside their home of citizenship or their place of usual residence for more than a year. In 2015, 248 million, 2020, 281 million. Important to remember that a full third of those migrations take place in the global south. It's not everybody headed to Germany or the United States or elsewhere. An important statistics motivating this effort, including our focus on visitors and tourists, is that while there were 281 million migrants living for at least a year, there were 1.53 billion visitors, 5 times the number of people moving for a short stay. And there's no, as you'll hear, regime for them. There were 123 million experiencing humanitarian distress, internally displaced 68 million, across a border 38 million refugees and asylum seekers. The numbers don't quite add up because there are also stateless person and other special categories out there. So we have a number of real lives at stake in this issue about the framework of rights and duties across borders. Equally importantly, the developing countries who can least financially afford it host 71% of the world's refugees. So the poorer countries are opening their doors, their homes, their employment, their social facilities to refugees in ways that are totally striking given the cost to them. The second source is jurisprudential. We're filling some gaps in 2 really fundamental treaties, the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees and the 1990 Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Their Families. In the Refugee Convention, classically, there's a narrow definition of the grounds for protection. You need to show that you've been persecuted. That is, there's some intentional acts directed against you because of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. What about people who are fleeing generalized violence? What about people who are fleeing other forms of discrimination? What about people whose islands are going underwater or whose fields are being desertified by droughts? Well, MIMC opens up the door to a broader group, not anybody in distress, but anybody who's experiencing external threat to life or arbitrary incarceration. So we've opened up the doors to people who are making equivalent kinds of claims as those that were made under the 51 Convention. We can do this because we also have measures that share responsibility. It's not just that the responsibility should fall on the country closest to the emergency. That's not the right burden holder. It should fall upon all who have a stake in protecting these basic human rights. And we have measures of shared responsibility within the treaty. For labor and voluntary migrants, of course, there's the 1990 Migrant Workers Convention, and it has many virtues attached to it. It established rights of unionization, equal pay to nationals, legal processes, etc., and that's good. But there are no ratifications, or very, very few ratifications, by countries of net destination. There are a couple exceptions to that generalization, but only a couple. And so it has not been seen as meeting the countries that are actually committed to providing the rights basis for those who are migrating to those countries. So it's very ineffective from that point of view. An example, temporary migrants, a very important category. They're in the Migrant Workers Convention, but they have too many rights and too few rights. in the Migrant Workers Convention. Too many because they extend rights equal to nationals, that is, equal to citizens with regard to access to education, including tertiary education, universities, housing, health care, etc. And citizens of countries that are paying those taxes don't want to share those rights that quickly with people who have just shown up to do temporary work. So too many. But at the same time, also too few. There needs to be a special regime for temporary workers that provides multiple visa entries so temporary workers can maintain their ties to their home countries easily. Doug Massey's been recommending this for many years. They need portable pensions, so pension rights that they earn in the country in which they're working, if they go back home, needs to be available to them back home. I was very pleased to see that showed up in the Los Angeles Declaration of 2022, which was a declaration signed by countries in the Americas. And we need a time cutoff to make sure that temporary workers don't become permanently temporary. That is, that they can increase their status towards a green card, maybe even citizenship at some point or another. And all of this requires facilitation so that there will be labor pools made available that foreigners seeking to migrate legally through well-established pathways can apply for work. And if they meet the credentials and there's an employer in a job that's not being filled by nationals, working at a Trump golf course, for example, to be very particular, those jobs will suddenly be available to those who want to immigrate in a lawful, legal way. That's very important. The other thing that's very important is that they need sponsors, and we're going to hear, I think, more about this from my colleague in a little bit. Why do we have this treaty the way it is? Well, one reason it's comprehensive is that there are some ways in which they are mutually supportive. The labor pool arrangement that we set up so that you can apply for a job, we give priority to people who are seeking asylum if they have the skills that are relevant for the job. They go to the front of the list. There are some synergies that we cultivate, a reason for a comprehensive treaty. The other reason that we have a global focus here, even though most of the action with regard to migration and refugees is bilateral, regional, or purely national, is that a global treaty can serve as a floor. It can inspire countries, even those who are not signatories or ratifiers, to live up to some of its provisions. And we have many criticisms of Turkey for the way it's operated with regard to some migrants, particularly the ones going into Europe. But they are hosting 3.6 million refugees. They don't call them refugees, but persons in their country, and they're treating them according to the good standards, by and large, in the Refugee Convention, if not better, giving them access to housing, health care, schools, etc. Many of them, of course, are Syrians from right across the border, but they come more broadly. So a global treaty can serve as a floor even for the non-ratifiers. And even the 51 Convention has that role. The challenge of a global treaty, and the reason why you want to get a good one or a better one, is that it also serves as a ceiling. And in 2017, there was a sad case of a Guatemalan woman who had been subject to domestic abuse back home, seeking temporary protected status here in the U.S. This is called the case of AB 2017. And she was turned down, and Attorney General Jeff Sessions explained why. And he said, our asylum laws are meant to protect those who, because of characteristics like race, religion, nationality, or political opinions, think the 51 Convention, which is what he's referring to here, cannot find protection in their home countries, he said. That's what it's for. They were never intended to provide asylum to all those who fear generalized violence, crime, personal vendettas, or lack job prospects. Yet vague, insubstantial, and subjective claims have swamped our system. And that's why he joined that case against AB in her attempt to get asylum here in the country. So a global treaty that's too limited can serve as too low a ceiling, mimic raises the ceiling in terms of protections, but it also has some duties attached to it. Let me just wrap up. We like MIMC, that is those who have contributed to it, you obviously hear, but it has limitations. It doesn't have anything about pandemic-induced mobility. We don't have clear standards for when you can legitimately close a border, when you should impose quarantine, when you should have an open border. We say nothing about that. We need much more on climate refugees. We've been writing on climate refugees, but we haven't reassembled to think about what are the standards that are broadly acceptable. We need more on digital nomads. During the course of COVID, there were all sorts of digital nomads. I was one. I was living in Philadelphia, teaching in Columbia. But the ones across borders raise all sorts of much more problematic issues. Which labor law applies, who's getting tax revenue, et cetera. We need to sort that out, and we haven't done that yet. And we need better governance frameworks. For example, our friend Alex Olenikov, one of the lead scholars who helped prepare this, has given a lot of thought to operational platforms. My good friend, another former student, Zaid Rad al-Hussein, the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, has also contributed some good ideas on all of this. So let me stop right here to Gregory.
Okay, okay, great, thank you. So maybe I should start with thank you to the council for having me, but also thank you to Michael. And Michael didn't put, I think, his work into enough perspective. So I'm going to start with his work and the treaty to say that I met Michael in the early 2000s, 2002, and he back then was working amongst his many other responsibilities to try to define the role of migration in the international system. He was tasked by Kofi Annan to create what was internally called the Doyle report. It wasn't released publicly, but it was meant to try to say that the United Nations should deal with migration, because it didn't at the time. And how could a multilateral system possibly exist that did not deal with migration? And so Michael was the pioneer in trying to open up that space, which is a space that I subsequently entered, and was then our probably greatest advocate in the UN system, and then at Columbia University when we had to move there with my then boss, Peter Sutherland, who was the UN Special Representative for Migration.
A great person, let me footnote that statement.
A great human being who passed away in 2017. Mm-hmm. But that, I think, says one thing that I want to say about Michael, which is you have to persist, right? This was 25 years ago that he started working on it. You have to persist. And the other thing that always stood out about Michael was that he was a professor by day, but also by day, he was trying to change the world. And that, I think, is something that he brought to Columbia. And that's also really important for anyone who's a professor in the room. I can't see who is, but you should take on that responsibility. It's incredibly important. You can't just be in the ivory tower. And now more than ever, right, we're seeing that now take place. The universities are at the center of developments here in the United States. So just wanted to start with that, which is really, and I should say, to address the question mark. I don't know if it was 20 question mark or 2020 question mark, but it's going to happen at some point because we are way stale in terms of the institutions that we have right now and the treaties. The 51 Convention is hanging on by a thread. It's effectively dead in many ways. Something is going to have to come into its place. I've been saying that, I think, now for 15 years. I've been criticized always for saying that because you don't want to talk about the convention, because if you talk about it, somehow it's going to disappear. But as you'll hear in a moment, despite Chris's description of me as being on the far left, I think you meant that spatially, but I am certainly not on the far left when it comes to migration. So let me just, I'm going to try to run for is it about 8 minutes, 10 minutes? Okay, so let me just say I'm going to address 3 points. One, that migration right now is being used, as we all see, as the tip of the spear to take on and to undermine and to destroy democracy. And that has been, for those of us who are in the field, pretty obvious for quite a long time. We are now seeing migrants targeted by the state, and in the targeting, several things are happening, which will apply to many more people than migrants. So thing one is surveillance. Right, so there is now a really powerful effort by DOJ to go into government and to hoover up all the data that there is on migrants. And for those of you who know government, this is not supposed to happen. There is supposed to be very careful gatekeeping of data. That is being destroyed. So that's one. That will not go into it. They're taking Social Security data. They're taking data from the IRS. They're taking data from all different parts of the system, from the court systems, and putting it into a single database. And they will then use that to target migrants. Two, as we're seeing, they're taking away the right to stay in this country, right? And when I think that is the most dangerous part of what they're doing, because if you can start to take people who are you consider your enemy and deport them, then you are going to silence your opposition. And the third thing, obviously, is the courts, right? So they're using high-profile migration-related cases to defy the courts, undermine the rule of law. So I won't go further into the state of what's happening today. You see that, but you cannot underestimate how important it is, and that it has been in the works for quite a long time in terms of being able to use this apparatus of surveillance, the apparatus of detention and deportation, and the attempt to undermine the courts. Those are hugely dangerous developments for this country, but also for other countries as well. So you might think that my saying that would lead me to conclude that the problem is the current administration. But I'm not going to say that. I think you have to understand the failures of progressives who have been in charge for 12 of the last 16 years in the United States. And we can do what we can right now, and I'll get into it a little bit, to take on these actions of the current administration that are, as I said, undermining not just immigrant rights, but also democratic institutions. But the real responsibility, I think, rests on those who have been in charge of the system for most of the past 20 years. And trying to understand why it is that 12 years of democratic government did not get us to an immigration system that worked. It's really important over the course of the coming years so that when there is another chance to build the system, we are able to do it. So let me just try to summarize a few things about this moment and why we've reached it in this way. So when Democrats were in charge, they did not address a system which has been chaotic, especially over the past 10 years, but over the past 20 or so years. There was chaos at the border. You had the kind of paradox that you had in a president and President Obama who was known as the deporter-in-chief, but that didn't solve the border problem either. So this is something that you've seen unfold as well in Europe, right? So the 2015 crisis, also a set of institutions in Europe that were unable to address chaos at the border. And that, I think, chaos is the defining story of failure amongst progressives. Why is that so hard to address? First, one of the questions is the treaty, right? So the interpretation of the Convention on the Right to Asylum. But there was also just a refusal amongst progressives to acknowledge the public desire for order, right? There was a disconnect between the elite policy discussions and what was happening at the community level. And I think it took Governor Abbott sending migrants up in buses to blue cities and states for that contradiction to be juxtaposed in such a way that really seized the attention of the elites. There was a prevalence of moral arguments over just pragmatic solution, problem solving, right? So you could make the case in progressive circles that you had to allow people in who were seeking asylum, but you didn't have to solve the resultant problems that came with, right? So if you champion the right to asylum, you should try to figure out what happens to asylum seekers. You should try to have a case management system at the border that's functional. Kate will tell us a little bit more about that. You should have a court system that can process cases in more than 5, 7, 8, 12 years. And above all, and this is, I think, a significant shortcoming, you should accept the fact that not everyone has the right to stay. So I think about the past 10 or 15 years as a kind of conspiracy of silence amongst those who benefited from having essentially an asylum system that was broken, right? So employers got a lot of workers who were without much leverage in terms of their rights, and progressives had the opportunity to see lots of people who they understandably felt should have a right to live in this country come across the border and disappear not completely, but because the court systems didn't work, they were able to stay and establish themselves here. And that all led to a lot of chaos in communities and a sense of fear that conservatives have exploited. And when there is chaos, you create the conditions for a strong man to come. And that is exactly what Trump has done twice. So let me stop there with the analysis. There's lots I could say about the adverse role of government in all this, the adverse role of foundations. I think foundations have played a really negative role in a lot of this. Litigation. I think that we've relied way too much on litigation to try to establish the rights of immigrants, when in fact this is a project of political persuasion. But we've just quietly gone into courts to try to expand rights without actually winning in the court of public opinion, which I think is eminently possible. So let me just switch now to what we are doing and what we have been doing, and talk about an idea that has seized my imagination for the better part of 20 years, and that I've had the privilege of working on within the context of philanthropy for more than a decade, which is the notion of sponsorship. The Canadian government in the late 70s created a program around private sponsorship that allowed individuals in Canadian communities to sponsor refugees. And it became the backbone of the Canadian system. In the United States, at the same time, in 1980, we passed our core refugee-related legislation and created a top-down, government-run system of refugee resettlement that has dominated the US space in the 45 years since. And it is a fundamentally different approach to immigration, right? So one says that communities can decide who comes in, and the other one says that the UNHCR and the State Department can tell communities who should come in to their cities and towns. And over the past 4 years during the Biden administration, we had the chance to see sponsorship in the United States bloom. And it took initially the form of Americans being allowed to sponsor Afghans who came in the summer of 2021. There was a small new program called Sponsor Circles that was created because there were so many Afghans on the bases. And then a few months later, that idea of allowing American citizens to take somebody and bring them into their community was expanded to Ukrainians in a program called Uniting for Ukraine. And when that program started in April of 2022, no one knew how many Americans would raise their hands. And incredibly, there's been 250,000 Ukrainians sponsored in the United States by Americans. And I won't get into the details of this, but it's worth noting, it was worth noting for me that there was a lot of criticism of that program as being racist, that it was criticized because people felt that it was only made applicable to white Christian, largely women and children from Ukraine, and the United States would never do something like that for other populations. And if they did, they wouldn't get sponsored. And so 6 months later, the Biden administration started a similar program for Venezuelans, expanded it in January of 2023 to Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans. And in 2 years, something on the order of 3 million migrants from those countries were sponsored by Americans About 500,000 were able to come in from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. I tell you that story because I should just add the other piece of that is that there was an official U.S. refugee program part of this effort. It was called the Welcome Corps, and that was for not just migrants who were named from specific countries, like from the other 5 countries that I mentioned, but then Americans through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program were able to sponsor formal refugees, and that program launched more or less in the last year of the Biden administration, and there were 35,000 sponsorship groups that were created around the country. The minimum was 5 people had to be in each of these sponsorship groups formally. The average was 15. Amongst them, they raised something on the order of $500 million to sponsor refugees, and that program, all of this has been shut down. So I give that as an example of what went wrong, right? So you had a system in the United States that in its best years, when it was government run completely, was able to bring in its best years, 80,000 refugees. And it was done in a painstaking, top-down way that was alienating to communities. And then when you created a system that was bottom-up, that allowed Americans to step forward and do the work of resettlement, you had a large multiple saying they wanted to do that. So what went wrong? Really, really worth thinking about, because it was a captured institution. The idea of refugee resettlement, the most progressive possible idea, was frankly captured by a refugee establishment that resisted in every possible way the idea that the American people should be resettling refugees. Our work right now, in addition to trying to defend against the attacks of the administration, along with this heroic group of NGOs that are underfunded, under attack by the administration, we're trying to help support them, but we're also litigating a series of cases that also include the refugee program and the sponsorship programs that I just mentioned. We are working really closely with cities and states to try to help shore them up as they are on the front lines of defending against the administration's actions. And we are, most importantly, in my own sort of view, focused on what happens going forward now. How do we build a system which, just with, as with sponsorship, how do we build an entire immigration system which is bottom-up, which is community-driven? I often use the term demand-driven. Immigration needs to be grounded in communities. Employers need to be able to bring in migrants. Humanitarian groups, faith groups, others need to bring in refugees. It has to be a system which is responsive to the needs of cities and states and towns around the country. I'm happy to go into detail, but I am now, I know, at my limit in terms of time. So thank you.
We really welcome some questions. I could start off by asking Gregory one. You know, what you described sounds to me to be, you know, morally obvious. That is that if one can find a way to provide assistance to people in desperate need, that others want to provide to them because they're proud to do so, because they think it builds their communities at the same time. The great mystery then is, why is it that our elected officials in Washington can't understand that they've got this wonderful opportunity in their hands to not only make themselves look good, but actually do good? And so it becomes a political mystery. And I was wondering whether you have any sense of, you know, where is the disconnect that doesn't, you know, connect our elected leaders to that kind of an outcome. I've known a few. I had a session in Philadelphia, and I'm going to wrap this question up very quickly. We had a session on MIMC with commentators from former Vice President Joe Biden and former political candidate Jeb Bush. And they didn't agree with everything in MIMC, you can be sure, but they really did agree on the view that work migrants and refugees should have a home in this country, and that we will be better for it, provided it's done within the framework of legal pathways. So here's two ex-politicians of different parties could get together. We put them down into office down in Washington, and we get nothing. So I was wondering, you've been thinking about this for a long time, and I was wondering what your sense is of where is the disconnect?
So when it comes to refugees, there was legislation. It set out who the players are on the playing field. It funded them well enough, and that refugee establishment just took hold, and it was very difficult, especially since a lot of the arguments around refugees are wrapped in dogma and sometimes hard to penetrate. From the outside, it was a system that worked, right? There was 9 resettlement agencies. The government decided how many people would come in. The UNHCR chose who was the most worthy in the world. When you tried to challenge it, we tried to challenge it for 10 years. There was just an incredible resistance from both the establishment that had a piece of the action, didn't want to see it change, even though you could make a really strong case that it would benefit them over time. We've just seen the whole system wiped out. The only thing that's working right now is sponsorship. There are still people coming in, SIVs, organized around sponsorship groups. You could make the case, but they were not willing to basically cede that ground. A fear of something working differently that might exclude them, I think, is what drove that logic. In terms of the bigger immigration system, in order to be able to have a system which is responsive to communities, to cities and states, you have to build the infrastructure that allows for that, right? So you have to have a way for a state to express a desire to bring in people. Vermont has been doing this in the current system. There are cities and towns in Vermont that really work hard to try to bring in migrants. It's not easy, but so the system isn't built to have demand expressed from the bottom up, nor to try to match migrants who might want to come here with specific destinations. We are now in an age of incredible technological advancement that would allow for people to try to find their place in the world. For a town or union, let's say in Milwaukee, that needs workers, construction workers, to be able to go out into the pool of global labor and identify 10 or 15,000 workers who could come to Milwaukee and help reconstruct whatever they're working on. So I think the systems aren't there, and the systems that are there are captured.
Mm-hmm. Okay. From the floor, or do we have any question, or from the internet?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Alex Whitson from Carnegie Council. I have a lot of virtual questions. I'll just ask one right now, kind of a philosophical question. Is it possible to reframe migration not as a problem to be managed, but as a shared creative force? If so, what kind of political language, narrative, or institutional form currently missing would that require?
Yeah, I would start on it, but I hope, what Gregory's been describing is a lot of that through sponsorship. What I would say in the context of MIMC, our view is that if somebody's life is in danger, we should find a way to provide rescue. That's the basic understanding in MIMC. And that, I think, has firm ethical foundations to it in ways that are, hard to contest. But there are many cases when it's not a life that's at stake. That is the immediate sense. It's well-being, and we all, of course, want to be better off. All the Americans who were the sons, daughters, grandsons, granddaughters of immigrants came here to make a better life for themselves. It's not surprising that other people are still trying to do this. But we also have commitments to our fellow citizens that are produced by the mere fact that the only way you can govern the world is with nation states so far, or states so far. We don't have a global governance that works. And moreover, we've sacrificed for each other. If we haven't done so very directly, our fathers or grandfathers fought in a war to preserve the security and the independence of the United States, and other countries have done the same thing. They have a stake in a collective well-being. So it's not illegitimate for American citizens to say that you have to come in legally into this country. You can't just walk across the border. And you do so in ways that advantage the U.S. because there are jobs that need to be filled. Or you have relatives who want to have you here, and in other ways that you are directly contributing. So either you should come in because your life is at stake, or you should come in because in the views of American citizens, including sponsors, employers, and others, you're going to make a direct contribution. And I think our legal pathways need to be formatted in a way that allows those, let's call them ethical foundations, to be realized practically. So that would be my response to that very good question.
Yeah, and I would just add, first, save lives. It's incredibly important to have whatever approach you're taking be anchored by that idea, for sure. But then I think the narrative where it has fallen apart is it's been compassion versus control. And the democratic left, the progressive left, has been identified with compassion, let them in, let them stay. And the right has been, the hard right, the far right has been identified with control in the current context, extreme control measures. And it's not either or, it's both. And the center has not held in this respect. There haven't been enough politicians who've been able to go out there and say we need both compassion and control and legal pathways, as you said.
Hello, my name is Audrey Johnson. I'm actually from University of Toronto, the Monk School of Global Affairs. I just finished, but I just finished my fellowship too from De Justicia as a Global North Fellow down in Colombia, Bogota, for human rights. And I did a lot of research because I grew up on my father's reservation. My dad's Potawatomi from northern Wisconsin. And I'm here for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and we were just talking about implementing UNDRIP entirely for the domestic countries in comparison, and I saw a lot of similarities for UNHCR and IOM. So my question though is how can common law be a way of legal mechanisms or policy to be utilized to help with migration in any shape or form specifically? Because when you compare it to Native American sovereignty, common law is actually the most common way, not the most common way, but the most applicable way of having forms of justice mechanisms or ways of reform to be brought in without having to rely on federal institutions in many ways. So, thank you.
I'm struggling a little bit, even though I teach in a law school, to get the practical potential connections that you're bringing to our attention. But there are a lot of common law principles, like hearing both sides, providing habeas corpus kinds of defenses for seizure, for principles with regard to things like theft and compensation that are relevant very broadly. That doesn't mean that they apply universally, despite some of the common law claims that they're universal. And one needs to adjust to every jurisdiction. And there are some cultures, it might be an indigenous culture, it might be a foreign culture, that have different standards. And of course, there are different frameworks of law, civic law traditions that are different from the common law. And so having any set of legal principles claiming universal validity is, I think, a step too far. You have to take into account exactly the kinds of standards that apply within a given jurisdiction and make them real and determining, unless one sees that those standards are so egregiously harmful to very basic principles, including the ones under the common law, like equality of parties within a court, et cetera, that kind of framework, that you'd want to resist them. So that's an abstract question, and I don't know exactly where you wanted to take it differently from that, but that's my best attempt at an answer to, it's a real issue. And in global constitutionalism, the discourse, those kinds of questions do arise. Two of my students this past semester wrote long papers on the civic law tradition and incompatibilities with the common law tradition. So I've seen some of that literature, and it's important. But it also has very practical conflicts that arise, and that's where I think it needs to be resolved. Yes, in the far back.
Hi, my name is Angelo Cabrera. So, we are reaching a stage in America where the majority of our community is getting older, right? So we need a new input of income into what the sources of Medicare, Medicaid, and this is a new workforce that, it is there right now, and I think just, what are your thoughts on that, looking from the perspective of the economic aspect of immigration in the United States?
Mm-hmm. I was going to turn this over to my colleague right here because he knows more about this than I do. But my preliminary response is that it's interesting when you talk about the last attempt to have a comprehensive immigration bill. The Republican on the other side of that was Marco Rubio, of all people. Many people think that the superiority of the American economy over the past 10 to 15 years compared to our good friends in Europe is a product of the fact that we have had immigration coming into this country in ways that allow us to grow in ways that the Europeans were not able to do. But I want to turn it over to Gregory, who knows a lot more about this than I do.
I realize that we're coming up to time, so I'll be really brief. But it's a nativist moment right now that's as harsh as it's been in decades. And that nativist moment will create a backlash, and the pendulum will swing again. So right now, if you want to summarize that, you have a narrative of deportations, self-deportation, you use that word. I'm so sorry you had to go through such a hard time, had to leave and weren't able to come back for a while. But we will realize as communities live in fear, as workers are ripped away from jobs. I was yesterday reading about a dairy farm in Vermont where there was a raid on Tuesday where the workers were detained, and a farmer who has a dairy farm that cannot function without workers immediately that next morning is going to be in big trouble. And yes, we can do what DeSantis is trying to do in Florida and lower the working age to 14 so that we can fill the labor market gaps that are created by deportations. But I think the narrative will change when people do realize not only the brutality of the deportation process and the impact on communities, tens of millions of people who won't show up for doctor's appointments, who don't show up for work, who are fearful of sending their kids to school. I think that will be the narrative change, but it will take time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael and Greg.
And thank you for your questions and comments. Thank you.